Hey there, it's Mattea. Thanks for taking the time to listen to Bookends today. Before we get into today's show, I have a little suggestion for you. If you've been enjoying our show, it would be a huge help for us, and I think also for you, to follow us on your favorite podcast app, whether that's Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Overcast, whatever app you use to listen. This will ultimately help us make more Bookends episodes and connect you with more of your favorite authors. I hope you enjoyed today's show. Thanks so much for listening. Hey there, I'm Mattea Roach. Welcome to Bookends. I want you to take a moment and try to picture your favorite color. If you're anything like me and like a lot of other people in the world, it seems, you might have pictured some shade of the color blue. When I think of blue, I picture the North Atlantic Ocean, specifically around where I grew up or around my mom's hometown. And my guest on the show today, Imani Perry, has had the color blue on her mind quite a lot lately. Imani's new book is called Black in Blues: How a Color Tells the Story of My People. And in this book, she explores connections between the color blue and her identity as a Black American woman. She draws on history, mythology, music, and more to offer surprising revelations about what it means to be Black in the United States today, and what the color blue has to do with it all. Imani Perry is a National Book Award winner and a professor at Harvard, and she joined me from her home in Philadelphia. Hi, Imani. Thank you for being here.
Thank you for having me.
Your new book begins in your grandmother's bedroom in this small house in Birmingham, Alabama. The description in the book is so evocative. I'm wondering if you can describe that room now for us.
Oh, yeah. I mean, it's one of the most precious places that I have ever been in my life. So my grandmother converted the dining room actually into her bedroom, and it was at the center of the house. And it was painted what to me was a sort of pale slate blue bedding, blue birds on the wall, blue drapes, and the like. But I had this experience with my cousin's young son, Ian, when he was quite small. I knew he loved blue the way I do. And he said, I asked him, what was his favorite color blue? And he said, that one. And he pointed. And up on the ceiling, there was a tile missing from when the ceiling had been dropped. And through the space that was left, you could see the original color blue of the room. You know, it was like a sky blue. It was much more brilliant. It was beautiful. And it was, you know, for me, a sign that blue was going to be a portal of sorts. This place that was a home place. It was the most comforting place, a place I loved to sleep in the bed with my grandmother. But it also was an entry point to thinking about, you know, this longer journey.
You mention in your book not getting to ask your grandmother directly about this preference for blue decor and why this place that was the center of her home and her private space as well, her bedroom, why she decorated it all in blue. But you have some theories that you explore.
Yeah.
Why do you think your grandmother in particular was so drawn to blue?
Well, there's so many reasons. I mean, part of it, and I speculate that there's this sort of parade of gorgeous blue wildflowers through the state of Alabama. And there's a way that the color was used by women like her and then some who are quite well known, like Rosa Parks and Fannie Lou Hamer and Coretta Scott King, for important occasions, that it has this color that has a kind of elegance and restraint in certain shades, but it still has that sort of delicacy and tenderness. I talk about blue as a contrapuntal color, meaning that it can mean two things at once or multiple things at once that even seem contradictory. It's a color that is hot as well as cold. It's a color that is lush. You know, we think about the sky and the seas, but there's also Oxford blue. I think it excites the imagination and it's beautiful. And I think one of the things that we underestimate and that I wanted to get to in this book is how much beauty was essential in the history of Black Americans, beauty in the face of terror or the creation of beauty at the very site of wounding. And so I don't even know actually if it was her favorite color, but I'm so grateful that she encased us in it.
You say that in your grandmother's bedroom, this is a space that you learned to love the color blue. But blue, of course, also has a meaning beyond just being a color. We talk about having the blues music, all of these things. And you say that you learned about the blues in your grandmother's bedroom as well. I'm wondering what you mean by that when you say you learned about the blues in this space.
Sure. We've had this season of a season of history, series of confrontations, exposures, evocations, right, about the painful history of racial inequality and various kinds of suffering that is meted out to people based upon the sort of accidents of birth, how they came into the world. And, there's been an appropriate sort of grappling with it, telling the stories of it, trying to explicate it. But there's something much more intimate that sometimes falls out of that conversation. And that is where the blues resides. The anguish, the sorrow, the questioning. And part of the reason that homemaking became so incredibly important is that you need a soft place to land in the face of heartbreak. And I just talked about the sort of social and political pieces, but of course there's also the kind of intimacies of heartbreak that happen in so many different ways that have to do with illness, that have to do with loss, that have to do with frustration, all of those sorts of things. So when I say I learned about the blues in her home, that was the space where we were safe to actually feel the feelings at the deepest level. And blues as a musical form is interesting because it is at once a space where people talked about having the blues, but it's also this space of working through the blues, right? So that it's a way of getting yourself out of the blues, to play the blues, to listen to the blues. And so that's also present too. There was a lot of laughter and joy inside, even when things were challenging in the external world.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's going back to that kind of contrapuntal thing that you mentioned about the color before, right? That even in the sense of blues music, of working through the blues, these sentiments and feelings, there's a duality there. Mm-hmm. I want to return to kind of the genesis of this book, Black and Blues, that travels from your grandmother's home in Alabama at the beginning to the coast of West Africa and back to America again, drawing connections to the color blue all throughout. You trace a path through the transatlantic slave trade, the American civil rights movement, literature, music. What questions were driving you as you put this book together? Like, what inspired you to weave this story in the way that you do?
So I had this conversation with Luke Russert once about when I was talking about the book, and he was saying he hadn't realized that looking at the sky and the water could be harrowing because his experiences with it had always been beautiful. And so in some ways, the question for me is, okay, they're people. They are not then Black or even African. They are all the various things that they are. And they encounter the institution of slavery. And the encounter with it happens in a variety of ways. And one of them I talk about is the trade in indigo, because indigo is as a dye that captured the imagination of the world and people loved it. And I thought about what was it like for an artisan who created indigo to then see him or herself traded for a block of indigo, and then to go on this harrowing journey across the ocean with the sky and the water having been turned from something sort of beautiful to look onto, but actually essentially existing in this pathway of terror, not knowing where the destination would be. And that, in some ways, the middle passage being part of being created into some other thing that was a mark of inferiority. And then, notwithstanding all of that, find ways to love the water and the skies again, and to fall in love with indigo. I found all this documentation of enslaved people wanting to wear the color indigo, cherishing indigo. And so in some ways, the question is, how is it that people, notwithstanding immense degradation, continue to find a sense of joy and beauty? That's really the question. And blue becomes a gift, because I see through the relationship with blue the answer to that question. It's a particular story, right? I'm talking about Black American and some Black diasporic journeys more broadly, because there's these sort of continued arteries of connection. But it really is also about the sort of universal quality of human beings that there is this capacity to continue to find love and beauty and joy, even in the face of devastation. And so the particular story of my people, I think, becomes a path to understanding how extraordinary humanity can be.
You remind us in your work and in your previous answer, I think, that the idea of Black people as a category is not something that always existed and is sort of a natural thing, right? It is colonialism and it is the slave trade that creates this as a category that sort of merges together a variety of people of different ethnic identities, very different from one another.
Right.
But you talk about this process of Black identity creation being ongoing and something that's kind of still in flux. Mm-hmm. I'm wondering if you can talk a bit more about that.
Sure. One of the ways I wanted to make clear is how the category of Black people happened in waves. It wasn't the case that people immediately embraced this thing that was placed upon them, but it was a sort of a harrowing learning of being placed in this group that had no particular meaning, no shared language, no shared identity, no shared culture necessarily. And then it is through the process of actually sort of living together and being together and finding a sense of self in contradistinction, in resistance to the way in which people were being categorized, that Black begins to have a meaning that can be embraced in some meaningful ways. And still it changes, right? So how that took shape in Brazil is different from how it took shape in the United States, is different from how it took shape in Jamaica or Haiti and the like. And then it is continuing to take shape. So race is, as we all know, is a social construct. So it's not ever going to be fixed. It's always moving and changing. And I don't think we should embrace race and racialization passively, but ask ourselves, okay, well, how do human beings make sense of this thing in ways that can be meaningful?
You mentioned the indigo trade as a very important kind of formative thing, that a lot of enslaved people had worked in indigo in Africa, then are brought to North America and are still having to work in the indigo trade, are being traded for indigo in some cases. You describe the indigo dye in your book as something that was very important for people, that people used to decorate their homes, their clothing. And indigo dye and the color blue more generally have continued to be this source of pleasure and pride and identity for many people, it seems.
Yeah.
Can you give some examples of what that actually looked like in practice?
In terms of the dye, I think one of the most beautiful examples for me is this 18th century fabric trader who is writing a letter and sort of stunned that there are slavers who are insisting that the material they bring back be blue, otherwise the women won't have it. The enslaved women won't have it. And it's just, this moment of a kind of this appreciation that the condition of enslavement was terrible, but people were still making choices and living lives and wanting beauty in the face of that. Another example that was really deeply moving to me is that if you're in the upper South of the United States, oftentimes you will see beds of periwinkle flowers. And like indigo dye, they're hardy, but they were planted by enslaved people in order to mark grave sites at a time when there were no headstones for the enslaved, and ritual practices of people of African descent were in some ways, often shuttered or had to be pursued in kind of fugitive ways. And so to this day, I walk around in places and see these beds of periwinkle flowers, and it has this just sort of this profound meaning that people left their mark even when it was not sort of formally recognized. So there's just so many examples. You see it in particular throughout homes in the Deep South, the use of haint blue on porches in South Carolina, which is supposed to protect against the entry of unwelcome spectral forces. And so it's all over the place.
You talk about blue beads as well as something else that was like this form of ancestral and spiritual protection that people used. Can you talk a bit more about that?
Some of this is through archaeological research where they sort of find plantation sites and they can find people who were enslaved wearing jewelry and beads. But it was also the case that through the Middle Passage, and the visual imagery we have of it is so harrowing, but it's important to conjure up just to make the point. People were stripped their clothing. Often their heads were shorn, and they were in the bottom, the holds of ships, in with all of the filth and chained together, and yet often had one piece of jewelry, and it could, in some instances, was a blue bead. Blue beads were particularly cherished by many West Africans, and particularly faceted blue beads that came from Europe, many from Venice. And so think about a single blue bead on the body of a person who had all other aspects of their identity, their story, their autonomy stripped away. This one precious sort of sign of being fully human and desiring something and wanting to hold on to it is quite profound. And there's, I have a little piece where I talk about Montesquieu making fun of Africans for cherishing beads and their beauty because they don't have any sort of market value in terms of the logic of Europe. And for me, that was also a really powerful sort of realization that part of the sort of the global economy that was built around the transatlantic slave trade and empire and colonialism was to create not just hierarchies of human beings, but hierarchies of desire and value. And so I love the reality that there are people who valued things that weren't necessarily sort of seen as important according to the logics of imperial markets, but were valued for their beauty.
Imani, I want to return to the question of music. I'm somebody who finds deep meaning in music that I listen to. And I try to recognize, in cases where Black music has kind of come into things like rock and roll, I think a lot of people have a relationship to the blues without even realizing that they have one because of how formative it's been for so many musicians outside of what we'd call the blues genre. You write that your people gave a sound to the world's favorite color.
Yeah.
And I'm wondering what you meant by that phrasing in your work.
It is a music that I think gives sound to the color because it is contrapuntal as well, because it has all of these dimensions. And I think that's why it's the foundation, certainly, of all American music. I mean, you can't talk about any genre of American music without a direct connection to the blues. And largely that has to do with the introduction of the blue note into the Western scale, which comes through people of African descent, and that we think of as a sort of this worried note, a sliding note, something that we think doesn't sound right, but isn't going to fit in the scale, but actually does. And part of what I'm trying to say is, well, in fact, it fits into the scale of its own, right? It's different from the Western music tradition, but it is absolutely coherent in the African diasporic tradition. And in some ways, it infuses the Western music tradition in ways that have captivated the whole world. So the sound has the same power as the color. I mean, there's just something about how the blues goes along with the color blue quite beautifully. And it's also, I'm a little long-winded, but I'll say I think this is important. What's interesting to me is how much the world has been in love with Black music and yet not necessarily in love with Black people.
Mm.
And there's something that I am trying to do in this book, which is in terms of pushing a reckoning with this sound that everybody seems to fall in love with, to be taken with. It comes from somewhere quite beautiful, and that deserves to be recognized as such.
Mm. You mentioned a number of sort of relevant examples. You talk about, for instance, like Louis Armstrong, Nina Simone. Are there any specific kind of archetypical examples of what music is that has a blue note?
The easiest example for someone who's unfamiliar with the genre would be if you hear guitarists sort of playing a note that is slurred, or if you hear, for people who listen to Aretha Franklin, I think everybody has listened to Aretha Franklin at some point, but the way in which you sort of will move through multiple notes in a way that is not where you don't necessarily hear each distinct note, but you hear it sort of veer off or kind of vibrate. I mean, so it's hard to explain, but it's something that everybody's ear is now attuned to if you listen to popular music that's at all global. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. You talk about Chain of Fools as an Aretha song that has that kind of slidiness in the chorus specifically. Yeah. You can hear the way she kind of comes up to the word chain.
Yeah. It's extraordinary, right? Because it does something to you internally. It's not just hearing it, but you feel the sound, you feel the sound, yeah.
Wow, this is like taking me back to this event I went to in Brooklyn last year that was the Brooklyn Fiddle Summit that brought together klezmer musicians and also Black fiddle musicians, both from Brooklyn. And when you talk about feeling something with a kind of blue note or whatever, the way that people were moving in that room, listening to this fiddle music, it was remarkable. I have videos on my phone that don't do it justice.
Oh, I love that example because one of the things that I think sometimes gets lost in the conversation around music is, genre is so much a marketing device, but that music is deeply, for lack of a better word, promiscuous, and forms love to come into contact with one another. And there are often these sort of incredibly beautiful moments when people have encounters from different experiences in creating sound. So I just love that example because to me, that's sort of at the core of what it means to love music. Yeah.
Mm. You mentioned before that there's a continued presence of blues music and inspiration from Black music in contemporary popular music. And there's a long legacy of artists being specifically inspired by the color blue as well. Nina Simone's first album, Little Girl Blue. We have Miles Davis, Kind of Blue. How do you see this legacy of both the color blue and blues music influencing Black artists who are working now?
Oh, it's evident in so many different ways. I mean, one of the things that I was fascinated by is how it appears in the work of visual artists now, so that a lot of Black visual artists, I think, are using the blue as a way of invoking the blues and even doing a lot of sort of blue-toned skin. And I think it's a way of kind of grappling with both the repetition of disappointment, of wound, and also trying to create beauty at the site of wound and that dance, as it were. So I think that's a part of what's happening visually. I think musically, there's, of course, the prevalence of the blue note, but there's also the sensibility of the blues that we see throughout popular music. Certainly, hip-hop has kind of returned to a blues sensibility in recent years. And I mean that both in terms of the sort of the emotion, but even the way that couplets are used, the way in which there's an engagement with both wound and pleasure, and the idea that the music itself is cathartic, that the music turns things around. The blues are all over the place, and blue repeats. And I would also say it has, some of the repetition is painful, right? So, we think about the boys in blue, the representation of police forces, the response to Black Lives Matter being Blue Lives Matter, that very long, difficult relationship in American history is also part of how the color blue appears in Black life.
Yeah, the first thought that I had actually when I heard the title of your book was it reminded me of this like art piece, visual art that I had seen about a year ago, Blue Devils by Chris O'Philly, the British painter. Yeah, you know it. Yeah, I remember I saw it. It was part of this exhibition about sort of the relationship between Black Caribbeans and the Black Caribbean diaspora community in the UK. And for folks who haven't seen this painting, if you look it up online, you almost have to change the brightness on your computer to see all of the different angles of this painting. That if you're standing at a certain distance from it, it was just looked monochromatic. And then if you stand at a different distance, you see this really detailed scene of basically police violence and kind of representing all of these different meanings of blue. So I was glad to see and glad to hear you talk about this kind of duality and tension about the color blue being this source of beauty, but also that it has this other valence now of it being a color that's associated with the police.
Yeah, but it's part of the story. I mean, I think so the representation of this force that is often quite violent and unjust, but it also, even that becoming part of the story in the same way that, the blue-green sharks that circled slave ships are part of the story. And so there's ways in which it can be harrowing, it can be spiritually meaningful and provocative, and it can also be a way in which to sort of play around with the circumstances of your life.
Mm-hmm. Imani, there's a character well, not a character, a person, but he kind of comes alive as a character in your book who is fascinating to read about, and I feel seems to embody a lot of the themes of your work kind of in one person. And this was someone who went by the name Brother Blue, who you first met in Massachusetts in the late 1970s when you were about 5 years old and your mom was attending graduate school at Harvard.
Yeah.
And you describe him as this brilliant and kind of whimsical man who was famous as a storyteller.
Yeah.
Who was Brother Blue, and what kind of an impression did he make on you at such a young age that he's still inspiring your writing and you still want to talk about him all these years later?
He told stories on the street of Cambridge and captured the imaginations of children and elders alike. And when he passed and people wrote sort of dedications and homages to him, like all of these Nobel laureates and and famous intellects and scientists and artists. And he himself had sort of come of age in difficult circumstances in Cleveland and gone to fight in World War II and then was a Harvard man. And you look at his photograph in the Harvard yearbook and he looks like that kind of straight-laced sort of ideal civil rights era type. And he went to various graduate schools. He went to Yale, Harvard, and then ultimately Antioch. But he made a choice that he wasn't going to be a kind of mainstream civil rights warrior, that he was going to try to change people's understanding of life by being a storyteller on the street. And he dressed all in blue. He described his clothes as rags, and he often had butterflies and streamers coming down from his clothing, and just a kind of magical soul. And he was always accompanied by his wife, Ruth. And she also dressed all in blue, but usually in a darker blue. And she was an archivist and had created the Black Women's Oral History Project at Radcliffe, at the Schlesinger Library. And they were these sort of wonderful companions, one who was the keeper of the stories, one who was the teller of the stories. And those two roles are necessary. They have to be shared. And I think it's part of why they encapsulate what I'm trying to do. I learned so much from the example.
Mm. We have a clip that we'd like to play, actually, of Brother Blue telling one of his stories, I think from just a year or two before his passing in 2009.
Kind of a crying there, you know what I'm saying? This thing is broke. You go right that old piano. You stand around that old piano. It's broke. You can't pay nobody to fix it. You ain't got the money. What you do is hold on now. You transpose. We call it the blues. Now look at here. If you're poor and you can't afford to get a piano tuner, you transpose. You work around that thing. Get that. I happen to like that, by the way. That's my favorite music.
How does it feel to hear that story now?
It's very emotional. And it's true. You transpose the work, the workaround in the most dire of circumstances. That's what the blues is. And you use the imagination to make it through. I feel like all those years of my life coming of age, he was teaching me that and teaching lots of folks that. And it, in some ways, the book is an opportunity to share the lesson,
You write that Brother Blue, is somebody that you listened to on the streets of Cambridge. You and he both attended a number of prestigious schools throughout the years, but you say that his classroom on the street was one of the most important of your life. Mm-hmm. I'm wondering, what do you feel you learned there from him that's different than what you would get out of more conventional education?
Well, one is that stories are at the very core of who we are as human beings. So that is how we make sense of the world. Data is important. Facts are important. Details are important. But stories are actually how we organize ourselves. I think the other part is that Brother Blue reminded me every time I saw him of the core of who I was, which is was born a Black girl in Alabama 9 years after the 16th Street Baptist Church bombing. That's who I am. And in very elite spaces and prestigious contexts, you can be dissuaded from understanding that the core of who you are is actually where you find meaning. And then there was the way people gathered around him, I learned something about the possibility of speaking across difference. Even the lilt in the voice you can hear is very much a Black man from the Midwest till the day he died. And so he was rooted in his experience and his identity and his culture and his story. And yet he was able to tell stories that resonated across extraordinary difference. And that was incredibly inspiring as a model. So I don't know if I learned how to do it, but I learned that that's something that I wanted to do.
I think that answer and also the work in this book has really demonstrated this process of identity making, of storytelling that I do think you're involved in. There's so many stories that are, told very lyrically in this book that's also a very fact-based work of history. It's incredible.
Thank you.
Now that this book is out in the world, do you feel like the process of writing it has shaped your own relationship to Blackness and the color blue? Are you more aware of these connections in your day-to-day?
Oh, yeah. I have these moments if I'm rereading a classic novel or watching a classic film and I didn't remember that there was blue and what kind of symbolism it shows up. But there's also, here is, I think, where it has impacted me most. I think a lot about collaging and quilting as part of the aesthetic of, and particularly a Black Southern aesthetic, right? That we, putting pieces together from shards and fragments and threads and trying to put them together in a way that creates a beautiful whole. I feel more aware of that as a process of living, the kind of the curated life that we make decisions about what we're pulling from and how we're trying to create in relation with each other on a daily basis, and that it's really important to be deliberate about that. And so, blue is the core color in Southern quilts. In a sense, blue doesn't have to be your color for that lesson, I think, to be understood and felt. And I hope some of that comes through in the book. I want us to be very deliberate in this time, in this moment of history, about what we do, with whom, how we put things together, how we decide to tell stories, and how we do that in community, but also in the creation of ourselves.
That feels like such a beautiful message and note to end this conversation on. Imani, thank you so much for chatting with me today.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate it.
That was my conversation with Imani Perry. She's the author of Black and Blues: How a Color Tells the Story of My People. This episode was produced by Katie Swales with help from Barb Carey. Ailey Yamamoto is our associate producer. Our senior producer is Jacqueline Kirk, and our executive producer is Aaron Balser. Big thanks to our audio tech, Aronde Williams, and the rest of the CBC Books team. Earlier in the show, you heard Aretha Franklin with her single from 1967, Chain of Fools. It was written by Don Covey and produced by Jerry Wexler. And you heard a clip of Hugh Morgan Hill, also known as Brother Blue, from a documentary produced by Beloved Creations. I'm Mattea Roach, and this is Bookends. You can tune in on Sundays and Wednesdays on CBC Radio, or follow the show on the podcast app of your choice. You can also come hang out with us on TikTok and Instagram at CBC Books. Thanks for listening, and I'll see you next time. Because when the book ends, the conversation begins.